At dawn, on the 18th of May, the 1st Brigade, now reinforced by an additional infantry battalion, renewed the attack on Samak, advancing in two columns led by armored vehicles, this time including light Renault 35 tanks backed by artillery. The Syrian infantry outflanked the village from the south. The fire from the Syrian 75mm cannon and 81mm mortars was accurate and devastating, while the Israeli 20mm guns jammed. The defenders retreated in confusion westward to Kibbutz Degania Aleph, leaving wounded and dying in Samak's rubble. Syrian artillery chased the retreating troops, but al-Kuwatli reprimanded his officers for wasting shells. By noon, the Syrians had reached and taken the police fort on the western edge of the village. Israeli losses that morning were 3 captured and 54 dead, most of them Jordan Valley kibbutzniks. The Syrian General Staff had a poor picture of what was happening. They appear to have believed that the Lebanese army had also crossed the border and conquered 3 settlements south of Ras el Nakura. The fall of Samak shook the morale of the Jordan Valley Haganah and precipitated a minor crisis in HGS. There was even confusion about the identity of the invaders. Ben-Gurion jotted down in his diary, "We have received word that the Legion has occupied Samak. There is something of a panic in the Jordan Valley." Moshe Dayan, the Haganah's Arab Affairs officer, was appointed OC of all forces in the area. The Syrian advance now threatened the kibbutzim Shahar HaGolan and Masada, south of Samak, and Degania Aleph, Dayan's birthplace, and the first kibbutz, and Degania Beit to the west. Without permission from headquarters, the members of Sha'ar HaGolam and Masada abandoned their homes and fled to nearby kibbutz Afakim. The abandoned sites were immediately looted by local Arabs. The Deganias evacuated their women and children. That night, between the 18th and 19th of May, a newly arrived company of Yifta Brigade troops counterattacked at Samak, but was driven back. The company came across tens of bodies. The Jews who had died in the Syrian assaults on the village. That same night, a seaborne platoon from Ein Gev landed at Samra, to the south, and raided the Syrian concentration on Tel al-Quasar. Though unsuccessful, the raid may have delayed the subsequent Syrian push on the Deganias by 24 hours, which were well used by the Israelis to prepare that night. Another Yifta company crossed the Jordan eastward and attacked the Syrian camp at the customs house near the main Benot Yaakov bridge north of the Sea of Galilee. The raid was a minor success. The Syrian defenders, 1 or 2 companies, fled after a brief firefight, and the Polmoniks, without loss, destroyed the camp and a number of vehicles, including 2 armored cars. But commando raids do not win battles, and by the 19th of May, morale in the lower Jordan Valley had plummeted. The events at Samak, Shahar HaGolan, and Masada had badly affected the inhabitants. In several settlements, The spirit of resistance had collapsed because of the strength and armor of the enemy, reported two veteran kibbutzniks. They added that without further reinforcements, the remaining settlements could not hold out. A delegation of kibbutz members set out for Tel Aviv, but even without seeing them, the Haganah High Command set about repairing the damage. Reinforcements were readied, and a back-stiffening order was issued by Yadin. No point should be abandoned. You must fight at each site. Yadin and Ben-Gurion faced off over the yeshiv's only available asset, the battery of 4 pre-World War I 65mm mountain guns without proper sights. Ben-Gurion wanted to send them to Jerusalem. Yadin insisted on the Jordan Valley. Ben-Gurion backed down, and to the valley they went, arriving in the nick of time on the slopes to the west of the Deganias. The denouement of the 20th of May came as something of a surprise. This could be a spelling error. Denouem. I think it's, let's say, denouncement. You pick. But anyway, of May the 20th came as something of a surprise. And not only, sorry, did I fully spell that? Denouement. I'm thinking it might be denouncement. Anyway, of the 20th of May came as something of a surprise, and not only to the Syrians. As anticipated by the Haganah, the Syrians launched a major push against the two Deganias. The defenders, about 70 in Degania Aleph and 80 in Degania Beit, the majority kibbutz members with a leavening of Haganah and Palma squads, were ordered to fight and die where they stood. There could be no retreat. The defenders enjoyed the support of 3 20mm guns at Beit Yarah, enfilading the road from Samak to Degania Aleph, and 4 81mm mortars, 3 of them positioned in Kinneret, a kibbutz just to the north, and the 4th at Degania Aleph itself. The kibbutz also had a Davidka mortar, but it exploded during the battle, injuring a crewman. Each of the Deganias also had a Piat, P-I-A-T, with 15 projectiles. And the Haganah had the battery of 65mm mountain guns. The Syrians attacked at dawn. First, there was a half-hour artillery barrage on the two kibbutzim. Then the 3rd Infantry Battalion, backed by 8 to 12 Renault 35 tanks and about 20 armored cars, in 3 columns, advanced across the 700 yards separating the Samak police fort from Degania Aleph's eastern redoubts. The Israelis let loose with all they had, and the Syrian infantry halted, but the tanks and their train of armored cars inched forward. I waited for the lead tank to reach 35 to 40 meters from me, and I fired one shot from the shoulder. I think the projectile was a dud. I had no choice but to straighten up out of the trench. I fired one shot from the hip, and I hit him, recalled Yitzhak Eshet, the Piat man at Degania Aleph. The tank was immobilized. In the tank's logbook, later found inside by the Israelis, its commander, Lieutenant Fayez Kadvi, had jotted down a few minutes earlier, "We attacked a settlement west of Samak." The 20mm cannon then hit 2 armored cars behind the tank. Another 2 tanks were set alight by grenades and Molotov cocktails after they had trampled the kibbutz's outer perimeter fence. The armored column was still operational, but it had left its infantry pinned down, hundreds of yards behind. The remaining tanks and armored cars turned around and pulled back. By 7:45 a.m. the assault had halted, though Syrian troops, digging in, still had held most of the territory between the Samak police fort and Degania Alep's fence. Then it was the turn of the Degania Beit. Artillery and tanks shelled the outworks. Around noon, the Syrians advanced. They were stopped about 100 yards from the perimeter fence. The defenders fought grimly, their homes just yards behind them. The Syrians began to dig in. The Deganias had stopped the Syrians, but they were still just beyond the perimeter fences, harassing the settlements with cannon fire and light arms. The stalemate didn't last. The 5-truck convoy with the 465mm mountain guns had slowly made its way northward from Paradis Katz in the coastal plain. They reached the heights of Alamot, above the Deganias, soon after noon. At 1:20 p.m. they were ready and began firing into Samak. Until then, the Syrians were certain that the Israelis possessed nothing and could reach their forward HQ. Now their commanders had to scramble for shelter. A lucky hit blew up a Syrian ammunition depot inside the village. The 65mm then lowered their sights and began to rake the infantry and armor strung out between Samak and the Deganias. The dry fields began to burn, and panic took hold. The Syrian infantry fled eastward in confusion, shells nipping at their heels. The armor followed. Syrian officers apparently shot some of the fleeing soldiers. All in all, they had had a very bad day. The fight at the Deganias had been bloody and frustrating. Now they were being subjected to a barrage no one had warned them of. They retreated all the way back to Tel el-Khazar, abandoning the ruins of Samak Masada and Shahar HaGolan on the way. The following day, the Haganah reoccupied Samak, its police fort, and the 2 kibbutzim, and sifted through the bodies of the 52 Jewish dead left behind in this retreat from Samak and the dozens of newly dead Syrians. The Syrians attributed their defeat to unpreparedness and the quality of Israeli fortifications. They also pointed to the lack of coordinations between various Syrian units and between the Syrians and the Iraqis, who, according to one Syrian historian, were supposed to have assisted them against the Deganias. Within days, the Syrian defense minister, the chief of staff, and the commanders of the 1st and 2nd Brigades had resigned. The defeat persuaded British observers that the Arabs would not win the war. Indeed, they spoke of the Luftwaffe's defeat in the Battle of Britain in 1940, after which it was clear that the Germans would not win the air war. A greater edge than the Syrians enjoyed at Degania they won't have again, they commented. Having failed in their thrust south of the Sea of Galilee, the Syrian army rested and regrouped, and a fortnight later re-entered the Galilee, this time just south of Lake Hula, at Mishmar Hayarden. A Moshev had dominated the Banat Yaakov bridge. Elements of the 2nd Brigade joined the 1st in the offensive. Their aim was probably limited to conquer one or more small chunks of territory in order to reach the start of the expected UN truce with an achievement in hand. The attack was probably coordinated with the Lebanese army, which on the 5th of June surprised and attacked the small Jewish garrison at al-Malikiya and overwhelmed it. The village had been taken in a commando-style attack by the Palma on the night of the 28th May. A few days later, the ALA which had withdrawn from central Palestine a fortnight before, returned to the country via al-Malikiya. Al-Kawaji established his headquarters in Nazareth. The Lebanese success at al-Malikiya marked their only real participation in the war and gave Beirut cover against accusations of indifference to the fate of Palestine. The Syrians were initially less successful. The 1st Brigade, now commanded by Colonel Anwar Benoud, attacked Mishmar Hayardin on the 5th and 6th of June, but without success. On the 9th of June, they tried again. Core elements of the 2nd Brigade, commanded by Colonel Tawfiq Bashir, fording the Jordan just north of the settlement. A mortar and artillery barrage preceded the assault. The Moshev, defended only by several dozen members, fell after a fierce fight. The Syrian assault was assisted by strafing runs of fighter bombers. Some 24 settlers were taken prisoner. A Syrian historian later wrote that the Jews had left 120 bodies dispersed among the fences, and from their mouths there was the smell of wine, which the Jews used to give their soldiers during battle. Elements of 2 IDF brigades, which were encamped in the area, failed to intervene, though a battery of 65mm cannon halted the Syrian advance westward, just short of Kibbutz Ayelet Hashahar and the Mosheva Mahanaim. There the Syrians remained until the start of the first truce on the 11th of June. They had gained a toehold west of the Jordan, giving them, on the military plain, the potential to renew offensive operations in the Galilee. On the political plane, they had gained a bargaining chip for future negotiations. The Lebanese Front. The Galilee Panhandle, bordered in the west and north by Lebanon and on the east by Syria, was defended by the Palma's Yifta Brigade. To the west was the Lebanese army with 3,500 troops in 4 infantry battalions, 2 artillery batteries, 74mm and 105mm, and an armored battalion consisting of armored cars and some light tanks. 2 of the battalions, with the armored cars and the artillery batteries, were deployed in southern Lebanon in April and early May 1948. According to the Arab League invasion plan, they were to advance down the coast road from Ras al-Nakura toward Acre and Haifa. But at the last moment, Lebanon, despite Prime Minister Riyad al-Shul's often fiery rhetoric, opted out of the invasion. On the 14th of May, President Bashara Khouri and his army chief of staff, General Fuad Shihab, both Maronite Christians, decided against Lebanese participation. Colonel Adel Shihab, commander of the Army's 1st Regiment Battalion, designated to cross into Israel, apparently refused to march. The Lebanese parliament, after bitter debate, ratified the decision the same day. The last-minute change of heart stemmed from the powerful Maronite community's dissatisfaction with Arab League policy vis-à-vis Zionism. The Maronites had always been ambivalent, and many regarded the Jews as potential allies against the hostile sea of Muslims that surrounded and threatened both communities. As one Israeli agent put it, in their hearts the Christians are happy with the establishment of the State of Israel. the Shiites of southern Lebanon, generally friendly with the Jewish settlements across the border, also appear to have had misgivings about the jihad against the Jews. There was a general recognition that the army was too small and ill-equipped to go to war, and a fear that hostilities might result in Israeli conquest of southern Lebanon. American and French representatives in Beirut apparently warned the Lebanese to stay out. Last, perhaps, the Haganah's Operation Ben Ami, in which the Carmeli Brigade, on the 13th of May, had advanced northward along and taken the very road the Lebanese had earmarked for their push southward, had acted as a deterrent. Lebanon decided to deploy its army defensively, but to cover itself politically in the inter-Arab arena. It also agreed to serve as a base for a small ALA invasion of Palestine, and to provide that force with covering artillery fire, a handful of armored cars, volunteers, and logistical support. The force, the 2nd Yarmouk Battalion, composed of several hundred Lebanese, Iraqi, Syrian, and Yugoslav volunteers, was commanded by the Syrian officer Adib Shishakli, and its mission no doubt was coordinated with the Syrian army, which was about to invade from the east. On the morning of the 15th of May, the ALA crossed the border and pushed into al-Malakiya, an abandoned Arab village that was a natural gateway from South Lebanon into the Galilee Panhandle. But the previous night, the Palma, realizing its importance, had sent in the Yifta Brigade, 1st Battalion, which after an arduous climb had fanned out in and around the village and the neighboring abandoned British Army camp. The two battalions met head-on in the alleyways of al-Malakiya and the surrounding hilltops. The ALA's advantage in artillery, the Palmaniks had none, and the rapid deployment of a company of Jordanian Bedouin volunteers, counteracting from the southwest, proved decisive. By nightfall, the Israelis began to retreat eastward, carrying as many as 150 dead and wounded back down the slope to the Jordan Valley. The Arabs dug in at al-Malikiya and the neighboring village of Qadis. Yet, though victorious, they too had suffered serious losses. Certainly they had lost the will to advance further. Indeed, their situation was such that the Shishlaki withdrew his garrison from the neighboring Nabi Yusha police fort to reinforce al-Malakiya. Subsequently, Beirut radio repeatedly announced that the Lebanese army had attacked Israel. The broadcasts were intended to fend off possible criticism of Lebanese non-participation in the pan-Arab effort. But the HIS had it right. One agent later reported that the Lebanese army did not join the invasion as its main forces were concentrated between Tyre and Ras al-Nakora to the west. Another that General Shahib had refused to invade Palestine and argued that his army is only a defensive army and incapable of offense, but let loose against Kibbutz Hanita in western Galilee with a mortar barrage in order to show that the Lebanese were also taking part in the war. Al-Malakiya had been a severe blow, but the Palma refused to concede defeat. On the night of the 15th of May, its commandos destroyed a bridge over the Litani River, some 6 miles north of the border, impairing Lebanon's ability to supply the invading column and forcing the Lebanese to devote resources to guarding their rear. The following night, Yifta units occupied the abandoned Nabi Yusha police fort just west of Quadis. The fort had previously withstood two determined Palma assaults. And on the night of the 28th of May, Yifta retook all Malikia itself. The brigade attacked the village simultaneously from Kibbutz Ramot Naphtali in the east, and from the rear an Israeli mechanized column, having crossed the border at Manara, some 6 miles to the north, and then driven down dirt tracks inside Lebanon without lights through a string of Lebanese villages before reaching al-Malakiya from the rear. The villagers had cheered the column, believing it to be Arab. In all, the Palma suffering 2 dead and 3 wounded in the operation. But on the 5th of June, as we have seen, the Lebanese army, assisted by a Syrian battalion and the ALA, recaptured al-Malakiya, which had been left in the hands of the Haganah Garrison Company. The conquest reopened a major supply route from South Lebanon to the upper Central Galilee, where the ALA was now concentrated. The attack, Lebanon's only success in the war, enabled Beirut to argue at last, and they had participated in the assault on Israel. The Lebanese army withdrew from al-Malakiya, handing it over to the ALA on the 8th of July at the end of the first truce. The invasion period ended with both sides attempting to gain local advantage on each front. In preparation for the truce, which could mark the end of the period of battles, there is a need to create facts on the ground of political importance by capturing certain enemy bases and by capturing our sites that were conquered by the enemy. Southern Front instructed the Giv'ati and Negev brigades. Giv'ati was told to take sites dominating the Egyptian-held area just north of Isdad, the Negev brigade, to clean up all the Arab villages captured by the Egyptian military force, and to mount raids on Egyptian supply depots. The Israeli troops proceeded to occupy hilltop positions and villages, Yashir, Batani, Garbai, Julis, Juzair, along the front lines, including the Beir Asluj police fort on the road between Aja el Hafir and Beersheba, an Egyptian supply route from Sinai. But they failed, as ordered, to take the Iraq Suwedin police fort or retake Nitzanim. The Egyptians, for their part, on the night of the 9th of June, captured Hill 69 west of Beit Daras in a fierce battle, and the following day occupied the main Majdel Fallujah, Buar Julis crossroads. The Jordanians raided Gezer, and the Syrians captured Mishmar, Hayarden, as described above. The air and naval war between the 15th of May and the 11th of June, 1948. Air and naval operations during the First Civil War, half of the 1948 war, were peripheral and had almost no impact on the fighting. The Palestinian Arabs had no air arm, and the Haganah's air service was small and insignificant, employed in reconnaissance, ferrying commanders, resupply, and marginal ground support missions. Neither side had navies. Air and naval operations were also of no great importance in most theaters of operation, and battles between the 15th of May and 11th of June 1948. Both Israel and the Arab states lacked serious air and naval capabilities. During the first weeks of the conventional war, the Israelis' light aircraft continued to bomb Arab encampments and columns, usually at night to avoid enemy interception, and usually with little effect, except marginally on morale. However, the Haganah had half a dozen combat-trained pilots, and soon they were joined by dozens of experienced North American, Commonwealth, and Western European flyers, who were to constitute the backbone of the IAF, formerly the Air Service. The air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon had none. Though relatively formidable on paper, in fact, counted for little. Many of Egypt's fighters and bombers were unserviceable. Few of its pilots were competent. Ground control, aircraft maintenance, and air intelligence were all poor to appalling. The same applied for the much smaller Syrian and Iraqi air forces. Because of losses and diminishing stocks of ammunition and spare parts, all these air forces contracted during the war. By contrast, the IAF grew steadily. The first 4 Messerschmitt fighters arrived in mid-May and went into action on the 29th and 30th of May. By the 11th of June, 11 Messerschmitts were operational, and by the 12th of August, 25. The Egyptian Air Force, using bombers and Spitfires, repeatedly attacked Israeli airfields, ground forces, rural settlements, and towns. Few casualties were caused, and these gradually fell off as Israeli air power grew and interception became more effective. In Tel Aviv, which was reportedly hit by Egyptian air raids, more than 40 civilians were killed. Most died on the 18th of May at the central bus station. Following the Messerschmitt attacks on the Egyptian and Iraqi columns, Egyptian fighters repeatedly hit Ekron airfield, where the Israeli fighters were based. On the 30th of May, Egyptian bombers aiming for Ekron hit the center of the town of Rehovot, including the CF, later Weizmann Institute, killing 7 and wounding 30. The following day, they hit Ekron airfield, hitting 2 partially assembled Messerschmitts. In part a response to the Egyptian air attacks, and in part a gut response to the Jordanian victories at Latrun, Ben-Gurion decided to bomb the Arab capitals. He seemed to think, based on his memories of the German blitz against London, that air power could prove decisive. Though given the poverty of Israeli resources, this was plain silly. Our Air Force has to bomb and destroy Amman. The weak link in the Arab coalition is Lebanon. When we break the Arab Legion's power and we bomb Amman, we will also destroy Transjordan, and then Syria will fall. If Egypt will still dare to fight, we will bomb Port Said, Alexandria, and Cairo, and thus we will end the war and pay back for the treatment of our forefathers by Egypt, Assyria, that is ancient Iraq, and Aram, that is ancient Assyria, and that is ancient Syria. In the early morning hours of the 1st of June, 2 IAF Rapids and 1 Bonanza flew to Amman and dropped several dozen 55 and 110-pound bombs on the town, the King's Palace, and the adjacent airfield under British control. About a dozen persons died, and a number of British aircraft were hit. The British warned Israel that if this reoccurred, they would hit its airfields and aircraft. Israel did not bomb Amman again. 10 days later, early on the 11th of June, hours before the first truce came into effect, a lone Dakota loaded to the gills with 176-pound bombs and incendiaries took off from Ekron, heading for Damascus. It was crewed by 7 Britons and South Africans. Flying northward, they could see Haifa to the west, lit up like a Christmas tree. At 3:12 a.m., the first bomb was thrown out of the rear door by 2 crewmen. In all, the plane made 6 passes over the Syrian capital, delivering 16 high-explosive bombs and 94-pound incendiaries, dispersed indiscriminately. The Syrians were caught completely by surprise. They sent up no interceptors, and anti-aircraft fire only began 10 minutes after the plane had left the area. A Western journalist, who witnessed the bombing later, wrote that 22 Syrians died and more than 100 were injured, and it put the fear of God into the inhabitants of Damascus. More significant, it forced the Syrians to think seriously about bolstering their air defenses and resulted in the diminution of their aerial activity over Israel during the following bout of fighting in mid-July. If air activity on both sides was largely of nuisance value and failed seriously to affect the ground fighting, naval operations were even of smaller significance during May and June 1948. Both sides used boats to ferry supplies and reinforcements to advancing ground units. The Haganah landed 450 troops and tons of ammunition and fuel in Nahariya during Operation Ben-Ami, and the Egyptians ferried troops and equipment to Majdal and Ishtad during their advance up the coastal road. Indeed, the first landing of Egyptian troops at Majdal took place on the 14th of May, a day before the start of the ground invasion. The only significant offensive naval operation took place on the 2nd to the 4th of June. On the 2nd of June, an Egyptian corvette briefly shelled Caesarea. On the 2nd of June, an Egyptian corvette briefly shelled Caesarea, where there was a small Israeli naval station, and then withdrew, causing no injuries and little damage. On the morning of the 4th of June, a 3-boat Egyptian flotilla, a corvette, a landing craft, and an armed troop carrier were sighted off Tel Aviv, apparently aiming to shell the city or launch a commando raid. The ships were engaged by the small frigate Elet, and the Israel Navy's only armed ship, but the later Egyptian guns kept it at bay after scoring several hits. 3 IAF light aircraft intervened, strafing and bombing the Egyptians as they maneuvered off Jaffa. One boat was hit by a bomb, and the Egyptians called it a day. Throwing up smoke screens, they sailed back to Port Said. One Israeli aircraft was shot down. The result of the 4-week contest between the Haganah IDF and the invading Arab armies was an Israeli victory. The Arabs had enjoyed major advantages, the initiative vastly superior firepower. And in retrospect, this was the only period in which they could have won the war or made major territorial gains at Jewish expense. But they failed. In effect, they were stopped in their tracks. The Syrians established a line just west of the old international border at Tel al-Qasr, with a symbolic gain at Mishmar Hayarden. The Jordanians and Iraqis occupying territory allotted to the Palestinian Arabs, except for the Jewish quarter of the Old City, and the Egyptians more or less reaching the northern limit of the southern chunk of Palestine allotted the Arabs at Ishtad, though they did cut off the northern Negev settlements, enclave, and the Negev Brigade. The Israelis had suffered many casualties, but they had contained the 4-pronged assault, and their army was far larger and better armed at the end of the 4 weeks than at the beginning. The invaders had failed to destroy any large Haganah IDF formations. The Israelis had held on to much of the territory earmarked for the state, and in some areas, Jaffa, Western Galilee, the Jerusalem corridor, and substantially added to their holdings. Moreover, after the first fortnight's containment battles, the Haganah IDF had moved over to the offensive on all fronts. By early June, the Israelis had caused the Arabs sufficient casualties and shock to persuade them to shelve any thought of further advance. The Israelis may have been unsuccessful in their initial counterattacks, Latrun, Ishdad, Jenin, but the strategic initiative had passed from Arab into Israeli hands, and